Welcome to the Plant Trainers Podcast, where we're helping people improve their quality of life through nutrition and fitness. And now, your hosts, nutrition and wellness coaches, international speakers, Adam and Shoshana Chaim.
Hey, I'm Adam Chaim.
And I'm Shoshana Chaim, and we are
Propelled by Plants. Today we bring to you episode 387, Food and Nutrition Economics with Nital Jethalal.
In this episode of the Plant Trainers Podcast, we talk with Nital Jethalal all about food and nutrition economics, or as the cool plant-based kids are saying these days, econ. If you've ever wondered what the impact would be if everybody went 80%, 90%, or even 100% plant-based, then you are going to get an insight into some of that in today's episode. If you ever thought about what effects would it have on the environment or on the economy or even on the healthcare system, you're in luck, because that's exactly what we talk about. We even talk about meat taxes. We're going to take a deeper look at all of that in today's show. Nital is a really smart guy, and you're going to be extremely intrigued by the conversation for sure.
Nital is a Toronto-based nutrition economics researcher. He was introduced to the benefits and wonders of whole food, plant-based living as a teenager. After working in strategic policy at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in 2008, he started to wonder what would happen if Canadians went largely plant-based. Over 10 years later, Nital founded PlantBased Economics, is one of three researchers behind plant-based data, and is increasingly active in food strategy in Toronto. He sits on the board of directors for both Toronto Vegetarian Association and the Toronto Veg Food Bank. He's currently focused on initiatives that help the city achieve climate change emission targets and initiatives that foster greater adoption of plant-based foods throughout the city. Nital has a master's in economics from Queen's University and an eCornell certificate in plant-based nutrition. He's also a Reiki practitioner and a yoga teacher. Great episode, great information. Hope you enjoy.
You've told us that you're bored of what you're cooking. You've told us that you're not eating out as much and you want to be a little bit more entertained with what's on our plate. So we showed up and we made the Plant-Based Comfort Foods cookbook. It is an e-cookbook that is above and beyond what we've done before. The pictures are gorgeous. The recipes are easy, but they're going to look restaurant quality. We are super excited for this book, and we can't wait for you to get your utensils on it. Check out the link in the show notes or check it out at planttrainers.com/shop.
And now for a moment of gratitude.
We've had quite a bit of snow in the last couple of weeks, and it's been great to see how the kids have embraced that. They've gone outside, they've built snowballs and snowballs and all kinds of cool things and have worked together. I'm very grateful that they have that time together. Not every moment is perfect, but when it is, it's wonderful.
I'm grateful for the same thing. I mean, the kids playing outside together during this weather and just interacting and just getting along so really well outside, and it's so nice to see it.
Nital Jethalal, thank you so much for joining us on the Plant Trainers Podcast.
Happy to be here.
We are happy that you're here too. We've been talking to you for so long. We've done so much work together, and we are excited for everybody to hear a little bit more about you and all the amazing things that you're doing. And before we get into that, we want to know if you have a moment of gratitude to share with us and the listeners.
Always. Today, there are two things I'm particularly grateful for, and one would be family. And in particular, it's my eldest niece's birthday today. She just turned 10. So I'm very grateful for them, for being close to them, and then also for community. And that includes you guys.
Happy birthday. Shout out to the niece. What's her name?
Her name is Karina.
Hi, Karina. All right, awesome.
Yeah, building community is so important. And throughout this whole pandemic that everybody's been going through, it's given a lot of people an opportunity to actually get a little bit closer to their families, spend more time with in a lot of cases. I mean, not for everybody, especially if they're out of town. But it's definitely something that we're consistently grateful for. And looking at this pandemic from a positive angle, that's one of the things that I think more families have the opportunity to eat meals together, hang out together. And that's something that certainly deserves a lot of gratitude.
I think a lot of people have found community outside their family as well, because they're not socializing as much, because people weren't necessarily online people before. Now, all of a sudden, they are online. They're finding communities that might be local, but that they're part of virtually, or because they have more time, now they're taking part virtually in more food fests or online summits and things like that, and really finding community there too, which can be very positive for people as well. And I mean, you've been doing amazing things over this whole COVID time, getting some things even just up and running. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about how you found plant-based and what changed for you in your life?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I get asked that sometimes, and it's plant-based kind of found me. I was raised vegetarian for religious reasons. I grew up Hindu, so it didn't take too much work. But things really escalated when my father, who's a physician, discovered Dr. Dean Ornish's research on heart disease. I remember that day because he was literally leafing through the Lancet. And for anybody who knows my father, he's really a man of execution and action. So within a couple months, he was at Dr. Ornish's retreat to see the results for himself firsthand. And next thing you know, he implemented it in his office. And there was that summer, I used to play a lot of baseball. And while I was trying to make what would have been an epic catch, I ran into a car and I had to pay it off in his through working in his office. And so I saw firsthand, like, I didn't really appreciate whole food plant-based and what was going on. And I was 15 at the time. And so within 3 months, you couldn't even recognize the people who were walking in, the ones who were then walking out. And to this day, actually, my entire family, not just my dad, runs into these former patients of his who had their lives transformed through this shift to a whole food plant-based living. And we joke about the randomness of it all the time. So I would say that definitely was a pivot for me. And then what changed for me, even though I grew up vegetarian, I did drink tons of cow's milk. I had a pretty serious addiction to cereal when I grew up. And when I gave up drinking cow's milk directly, I noticed a massive shift in my energy. Any acne that I had at the time vanished as well. My skin totally improved. And then once I finally went like full on whole food plant-based, or at least, 80-20, in my late 20s, I noticed I began to age slower. And I'm in better shape now than I was 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing how you think that you're okay and then all of a sudden things change. And I love how you say 80-20 because, going to all these veg food fests, there's always something you want to try. There's always something that's got oil or is a little bit too processed. But if your day-to-day is pretty clean, your energy levels are up, your skin is looking the best that it ever has, and you never feel your age.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the changes that you went through, and a lot of the guests that we talk to, a lot of the people that we interact with, whether it's clients or friends or just acquaintances, they all go through some type of change when they transition to a plant-based lifestyle, if they choose to. And a lot of people that don't, they don't really know the change that's possible until they actually make that shift. So it really begs the question. I know you've been working on this on a larger scale, but what would happen if everybody just transitioned to a plant-based lifestyle? What would the impact on them as individuals, but also on our environment, our planet, our whole entire world? What would the difference be? And I know that's something that you've been studying and working towards. So we'd love for you to share that information with us. So maybe we could talk through that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the $1 million question. It's actually been on my mind. I used to work at Agriculture Canada. And I was asked one day before I worked in strategic policy, and I was on the team that worked on this Growing Forward, which was the first framework for national food strategy and policy in Canada, like between federal, provincial, and territorial governments. And before that started, they asked me to track what would happen if everybody ate by the food guide back then, which obviously was a bit of a suboptimal food guide. And that's where the start of the light bulb, the first flick, I guess, happened, because as I told you, seeing what I'd seen as a teenager in my dad's office, I was like, this is a good question. And then I started to develop it in my head. What would happen if everybody went not just by the food guide, but vegan or whole food plant-based? And it's a particularly interesting question for Canada because we have pretty socialized healthcare. We have a relatively small country in terms of population. We have a lot of natural resources, and we care a lot about the environment. So it's a very multidisciplinary question that involves a lot of different branches. And 10 years later, I actually did go to school to study this question. I went to Guelph to start a second master's and PhD, but there wasn't that much interest then. So to be honest with you, actually, I spent that time totally in a different area. I played poker professionally for a while. And then the food guide changed. And suddenly I was back in the game. So I've been looking at this since then, since about 2018. And only recently did that lead me to found plant-based economics. And it's because the areas you just mentioned, Adam, there hasn't been much analysis linking them together. And having worked in Ag Canada myself, you can see how beholden policymakers are to industry interests firsthand. And it's not even like a lot of us protest it, but it makes sense, right? Like if you don't have another option, or you've never been introduced to whole food plant-based living, you're going to go with the status quo, right? So this has been something that has been on my mind, not just from the individual perspective, but also like structurally, because I think there's many vegans out there, people who at least go vegan, a lot of us go through a militant phase in a way. You want everybody to know, you want everybody to change, but it's interesting. And so I would see people in animal agriculture kind of as not enemies, right, but on the other side of the fence. And only at that time did I realize I was working on a memorandum to cabinet, which is how policy changes, on tobacco. We were transitioning tobacco farmers, and we didn't do a very good job. And surprisingly, they were able successfully to claim they were in crisis. So for years, tobacco was declining, demand for tobacco was declining, but then suddenly they jumped out of it, and we put them into things like ginseng and asparagus, etc., and it didn't really work. And that was the second flick of the light bulb, which is that, this takes a lot of time on that end. So it's not just looking at what would happen in terms of the health side for the population, but what would happen in terms of the production? Like what would happen in Canada? So there's this concept in economics of elasticity, which is the degree to which consumers or producers change their demand or supply in response to a change in price or a change in your income level. And as you can imagine, when it comes to food, demand can be pretty elastic. That's basically the simplicity of it. We'll buy less of a particular food if its price goes up a lot or if we have less money. Supply, on the other hand, though, is much more inelastic, and especially for animal agriculture. And so I see dairy going down the same path as tobacco once was. And to give you guys a bit of a snapshot here, so this plant-based economics, it ties together these different areas of agricultural economics, health economics. It includes some behavioral economics. So agricultural economics is around the allocation, distribution, and use of resources and commodities produced through farming. Things like prices and markets and taxes like a meat tax and subsidies, consumption, production. And then health economics is obviously focused more on the health side, where you look at the healthcare system. And it obviously will have a massive impact on our environment, our resources. And so my goal is ultimately to kind of tie these things together to produce an actual net figure if we can. And that will help drive this policy conversation. I don't know if you guys remember, but when the food guide changed or was in the process of changing, the Globe and Mail published an article about the conversation between Agriculture and Health Canada. And it was through an access to information protocol called an ATIP request. So that showed a lot. It showed that like the department, understandably, but like they're to bat for producers. And they actually did ask Health Canada to dampen or neutralize a lot of their language around promoting plant-based and taking dairy out for things like that. And so there's a real need for us to tie these things together a little bit more closely. And I've been paying a little bit more close attention to who's looking at different things there. But just to put this in perspective, so the global economy, for example, there's $80 trillion of GDP out there. And in Canada, our GDP is about 1.7 trillion. Now, agriculture for us is less than 3% of our GDP. Globally, it's around 5 to 6%. But you can imagine, like, think about how protected our interests are, right? And that's just for this small slice. But if you look at countries in the lower income regions, African countries, I think Sierra Leone has over 50% of its GDP coming from agriculture. And for many other countries who are in the level 1 to 2 range, which is less than $2 to $8 a day, it's over 20%. So there's a massive impact that agriculture can play in these other countries, and how we demand the way we demand food, things like chocolate, et cetera, that we import or export, those kinds of factors matter a lot, and how resources and allocation will shift. And meat in particular, it's I don't know, I imagine listeners might be a little interested, but as vegans, we like to really celebrate the rise of veganism. It is for sure taking hold, but we forget that as people get more money, and this is true for hundreds of years, they buy more animal products. And so there's a straight increasing correlation between income and meat consumption. And we're set to see 300 million more people leave this level 1, the extreme poverty, and then by 2050. So globally, the meat sector is about 946 billion, and that's set to grow around 4%. And the world today produces 4 times more meat than it did 50 years ago. Pig meat's the most popular, but production of poultry is rising, and so in Canada as well. So a lot of people who might be listening who are plant-based or vegan, obviously we care a lot about the 80 million or so billion land animals that are slaughtered for meat annually. And how do we reconcile the rise in veganism with this reality that this is going on globally? So for me in particular, this work has really shifted my appreciation for the supply side disruption that's going to be happening. And so like the family farm has really become a myth. 90 years ago, 1 in 3 Canadians lived on farms, but by 2006, it was 1 in 43. Today, it's, I think, 1 in 80. We used to have about 728,000, 730,000 farms back then, but now there's under 200,000. But the production has still been high, right? So the average farm size has nearly doubled, and we're seeing the rise of industrial animal agriculture. That is a big area of focus for me in trying to appreciate how exactly Canada's role fits in to global shifts and whatnot. But over to the health, so in terms of agricultural economics.
Can I ask a question in there?
Yes.
And I don't know
Absolutely.
if you know the answer, but since we've had that shift in our food guide, and since we really have in Canada and the US, I think, seen a rise of plant-based eating, at least 80%, or vegan eating, has there been a shift in the economy in terms of are there less dollars being spent on animal products, or are so many more people eating more plant-based products, but people are continuing to eat even more animal products on that side? So have we made any kind of dip?
Great question. So overall, yes, in Canada, it looks to be the case, but it is being that people are looking at this now, but we have reduced beef, pork, and dairy consumption. But at the same time, fish has gone up a little bit and chicken has accelerated a lot. So overall, there has been a dip, but it's also people are also giving up red meat and dairy for fish and chicken at some point. That said, there has been a massive rise in the plant-based markets. And I think we're going to continue seeing that. Like the global plant-based market is just around $12 billion right now, but the predicted growth is at 15% over the next 6 years. And to put that in perspective, 5 to 10% compound growth is considered good. And the number I just mentioned to you about the global meat market, which is just under $1 trillion, is set to grow about 4%. So we're going to see an explosion, and we already have, right? You look at Beyond Meat and other things, but really, when I first started vegan, I really wanted to think that activism was going to get the job done for me, changing the hearts and minds of many. But you have, on the one hand, all sorts of people in different areas of the world who are getting into poverty, who are just going to naturally consume more. And then you have to accept that not everybody's looking to fully get out of the game of eating meat. So with the grain of salt, I started to really push more towards accepting 80-20 and 90-10. And where we're going to see huge changes are in cultured meat, like not just plant-based meats, but like if people are interested, I really recommend checking out the Good Food Institute. They have a lot of great work and also good synopses on where the plant-based markets are. They cover all sorts of stats. One of the interesting ones I like looking at is Western Europe, because the plant-based market there has doubled in size since 2012, which is massive. And we haven't even seen plant-based fish or seafood, really. Those are still in their infancy. I think in the U.S., the annual sales are maybe 10 million for those, which is dwarfed massively in comparison to all plant-based meats. I think are about 800 million there. But yeah, we also haven't seen the rise of lab-grown meat that much. That's set to become the next big sector. Toronto's Liz Marshall has a great movie, Meet the Future, on this, which I highly recommend to people to check out. And you might have seen in the news this week, I don't know if you guys, that the U.S. startup Eat Just got approval to sell lab-grown chicken at a restaurant in Singapore. So that's huge. And then there's also other technologies that we're not even familiar with in the mainstream. There's something called precision fermentation, which, to be honest with you guys, I'm not fully sure what that is still. But there's a think tank called Rethink X. I think they're based both in Australia and the UK, that predicted U.S. dairy and cattle industry will actually collapse by 2030 because of this technology.
Let's take a little break so I can tell you about our plant-based comfort foods cookbook. This is comfort food, but I'm telling you, it is healthy. Most of the recipes are gluten-free. All of the recipes, except for 1 or 2 desserts, can be made completely oil-free and have oil-free options right in them. The pictures are going to make you drool. This book is above and beyond what we have put out there before. We're talking about red sweet potato curry, garlic zucchini and tomato pasta, vegan tahini tray bake, tofu pad thai, chocolate brownies. This is amazing. You're going to have enough food for weeks and weeks. And the great thing about this is that we've also included a meal plan and shopping guide to go with it. So if you just wanted to print out that page and go shopping, you'll know exactly what to make for the next 2-3 weeks. This is incredible. Please check it out in the show notes, or you can go to planttrainers.com/shop and check out our plant-based comfort foods cookbook. Guys, this is going to blow you away. And now back to the show.
There's like this whole new wave of companies using a suite of these engineered microorganisms, which are like yeast and bacteria and fungi, to produce basically everything. There's a company making collagen and gelatin. There's another making egg proteins from them. You know about Impossible Foods. So there's definitely going to be more of a dip in the future because these technologies will make those things much more widespread. As far as the healthiness of those products, the jury's still out, like how much healthier are they? But overall, absolutely, it'll save lives of animals and it'll be much, much better for the environment.
Right. The numbers that you were sharing before were specific to Canada for the most part, but they do relate to other parts of the world. I would assume there would be similar trends depending on where in the world people are listening from. Is that right?
Absolutely. Although less so in countries that aren't in advanced agricultural markets that I was telling you about, that are very heavy on the side of GDP for agriculture as a percentage of their GDP.
I think North America and Europe would be following a similar trend, right?
Yeah. And even Australia is leading the world in terms of the organic market. So like you're seeing a rise in organic foods in all sorts of random places. Like China and India have really embraced organic foods. Russia has a national strategy by 2025 to be fully organic, which is both impressive and slightly alarming on the back end. You never know what's going on over there. But in a lot of different markets, advanced markets, it's definitely a trend we're seeing. And in that relationship I mentioned to you earlier about income and meat consumption going straight up, there has been something of a downward shaping. Some studies have found out it's actually trending downwards after you get to a certain point in income, which is super interesting, showing that as we're wealthy enough, people are starting to, in these areas where we have a certain income level, that we're starting to actually decrease our meat consumption.
Mm-hmm. There's a huge difference between a plant-based lifestyle, a whole food plant-based lifestyle, vegan, and a whole food plant-based vegan. And there's obviously a continual rise of chronic illness and disease all over the world. And I wonder how the impact of an actual whole food plant-based lifestyle is on our health economy. And if you've looked at that at all, and I know you mentioned a little bit earlier, but how much of a difference could this possibly make or is already making, no matter where you live in the world, on your health economy and possibly even nutrition in general?
Oh, man. I'm trying to stay very calm right now because that question gets me very excited. I look at that a lot because in Canada, it's a huge area of interest. And I mean, so just to provide a snapshot, we spend about 12% of our GDP on healthcare, which is a lot of money. 70% of that comes from public funds too. So we actually all have an interest in the population getting healthier. And given, you guys must know as well as anybody out there, these benefits. So it works out to about $7,000 a person we're spending on healthcare. And the way I frame this to people who aren't interested at all in whole food plant-based living is, how would you like some of that money back? It would be a massive shift. I mean, just putting aside the vegan component of the whole food plant-based, like getting away from ultra-processed foods, which is where about half of our calories come from. Like one really depressing stat in Canada is about the group that eats the most ultra-processed foods is 9 to 13-year-olds. And it's over half of their calories are coming from that. And so, as you guys can probably appreciate, cardiovascular disease and cancer are the two biggest leading causes of death globally for decades. And that's also true for Canada. I think in 2017, there was about 18 million worldwide deaths from heart disease and around 10 for cancer. And so we've seen a litany of studies by now show that you can actually really reduce, and there's a little bit of tension in the plant-based health community right now around the reversal of heart disease, but whatever the terminology wants to be is you can pretty much get your health back. Even if you have terrible heart disease. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen people not being able to tie their shoelaces walk out of my dad's office 3 months later with like their health in check. So there's a massive burden of that heart disease, and type 2 diabetes is also exploding in Canada. It costs us about $35 billion a year, and diabetes is massively rising across like the world. It's quite sad. I think the Lancet did a piece in 2015 estimating it to be over $1 trillion. So there's a huge health economic component to all of this. And part of this work at Plant-Based Economics is to see if we can start to really put dollars next to the savings we get from shifting to whole food plant-based. And a lot of that comes from the health savings, the healthcare savings. We can start to reallocate it to animal agriculture farmers to transition out. We can kind of treat it like a trade adjustment assistance in a way. Like the way free trade works is when we lose a part of our economy to free trade being us being disadvantaged by free trade, then you have to get people into different areas. So there's a real role to play here in retraining and employment. And while I'm no expert in that area at all, it's definitely on the radar to start to tie these things together. Just because it's crazy now that there's actually, even though there's over 2 billion people who have micronutrient deficiencies worldwide, we now have a global population, a greater global population that's overweight or obese. Like that basically outnumber those with insufficient caloric intake. And each one of those is a massive drain on the healthcare system. So there's a lot to be saved.
And it's starting at such a young age, which is even crazier.
It is. And it's also scary. And here's where my mind goes, because I'm a storyteller in my mind. So I'm telling the story of a country that cuts back on Oreos, cuts back on processed foods. Maybe the government bans it, or maybe the government taxes it so heavily. And then all of a sudden, all of those shelves in the grocery store are cut down tremendously, which means that Canadian producers, those factories are being cut down tremendously, which means that there is more unemployment in that area. And sure, we can create more agricultural jobs in Canada, growing more apples and growing more soy. But to what extent can we do that in the type of climate country that we live in with what we have, and so many of our whole food plant-based foods actually being imports? And then and so yes, we're making people healthier, and yes, we're saving money on our healthcare system, but what are we doing to the economy in general? Not saying that that's what I want, obviously, but that's the story that I'm kind of telling myself, saying, we're going to give up one, we're going to make people healthier, but then unemployment rates are going to go down, and mental health issues are going to go up, and drug and alcohol abuse might end up going up. So where does that leave us? Am I telling the proper story? Can you make this more positive for me?
Yeah, well, one way to make it more positive, to reframe, you put it back in the framework of what we just discussed in terms of the share of agriculture in our country being less than 3% of our GDP. I think it's roughly 2.5%. And the share of healthcare expenditures, which is over 12%. So if we did have this shift, which would be amazing, the amount we could save in healthcare within, let's say, 4 to 5 years would very much outweigh what we would lose in terms of the employment share that we'd have. But it's a very fair point. And it's part of the reason why you're seeing the fishing industry really struggle to transition. Is like we're trying to figure out what to do. Like the average farm operator in Canada is still over the age of 50, I believe. And this is a huge issue. Is what do you do? I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Like, for example, food processors. Because it's hard for me to really believe on a wide-scale basis that processed foods would be of health value to us. So, and that's a big chunk of what happens with our food economy. So I do think this is part of the reason why I'm in this work, is to try and tie these things together a lot. But when you just mentioned the tax, that's a very interesting concept, the meat tax, because just like with other sin taxes, like tobacco, you would use the revenue you gain both for education and for retraining. That's one option. And there was actually a study I was reading yesterday done, I think it was in the Lancet, one of the Lancet's, offsprings, around a meat tax. And because it's happened before, but not much. Denmark had one in 2011, but they repealed it in 2012, even though it worked on saturated fat. But we've seen them work. Like in Mexico, you guys might remember, there was a soda tax. And soft drink sales went down 6% that year. And that's obviously, like, sugar-sweetened beverages are a massive source of this terrible ultra-processed caloric intake. If anybody's interested, by the way, we have a great resource in Toronto looking at that. His name is John Siebenpfeifer out of U of T, who works with David Jenkins. And he specifically looks at sugar-sweetened beverages and their effect on health. So I think the study was, I might be mistaken. I think it was in the Journal of Nature and Climate Change, but wherever it was, it showed that meat taxes do work. Like if we increase the price of beef by 40%, we'd actually see a drop in consumption. I think it was somewhere in the 12-13% range. The issue around the tax, though, is that for animal products, there's like very high probability you'd see a black market develop, which is kind of a crazy concept and story as well to add in, is the idea of black market beef and steaks, like, whereas alcohol and tobacco are tougher to produce. That we need to find ways to make more public policies around examining making fruits and vegetables more affordable for low-income families, especially, while also figuring out how to retrain and prepare people to either get out of what they're doing, like let's say it's dairy, or to figure out how to make it work, like how to keep. Dairy's a bit of a one-off in Canada because it tends to be a little bit more of a rich, older white men's club, for lack of a better descriptor. So it's a tough question to answer, and it requires, that's part of the reason why we need this multidisciplinary approach. But overall, our healthcare savings would outweigh the unemployment we'd see.
The other way that I think we're starting to see more and more of our healthcare being taxed because of it, not taxed, but it's taxing our healthcare, is because I'm starting to see some clients, and I don't have any proof of it, but I'm starting to see clients who are working in these processed food industries, and despite them maybe making healthier choices, and if you're exposed to Oreo cookies all day, trust me, that's the last thing that you want to eat, right? So they're eating fairly well, but because they are inhaling and absorbing a lot of the toxins and processed foods through their skin, through their nose, through their mouth, people are starting to become sick on the inside despite being maybe a good weight or exercising or eating better. Can you speak to that at all? Is that anything that you've come across?
Oh, wow. In fact, it's not. It doesn't surprise me, but that's tough. That's actually really sad.
It's a whole other point, like a whole other section of it, right?
Yeah, that kind of gets at the broader concept here, which sometimes it's too much to even think about, of food supply. You guys might remember from Veg Food Fest that we featured that movie, The Need to Grow. Mm. A lot of documentaries that focus on soil health and economics, which we don't need to touch on today, but is a fascinating area, is around decentralizing food supply. And we are at a place now today where there's a lot of merit to discussing this in greater depth. There's many, many organizations looking at that. But with what we have right now, the structure that we have, and the story you just mentioned, Shoshana, I don't see how we get around it when we have this widespread and aggregated food supply and large-scale production.
We talk a lot about health, nutrition, fitness on the show. We don't talk that often about the impact of the economy on everything that we're doing. So it's really important, this information. And for people that are listening, what do they do next? Like, how do they contribute? What is their step, or is there action that they could take to kind of help improve society or the economy or lifestyle in general? Like, what can they do at this point?
Great question. I get asked that a lot, even though I consider myself, work is still very much in its infancy. But the broadest principle that I stick to is vote with your dollars. And that one, even as obvious as it is, it merits restating. So, and especially now during COVID, right? Like I've noticed, I've particularly shifted away from buying. I've started buying more organic and local produce where I can, or at least from people who are smaller businesses. I would also recommend, there's a big untold story where I see a lot of development for the case of the vegan movement in terms of economy and structurally speaking, is with life insurance. So there are a lot of life insurance companies out there starting to point out that vegans can actually are overpaying for life insurance. Like Health IQ is one in the US. And it's, you guys know very well, like we have lower risks of all-cause mortality, lower risks of cancer. We have 50% lower risk of type 2 diabetes. So I would really recommend for people, wherever they are in the world, to actually talk to your life insurance company, point these things out, point out what the competitors are doing, because that will also help shift the needle. The insurance industry is huge. There's a few others. I would highly recommend people grow their own food. That's something Dr. Zach Bush talks about this a lot, but we used to grow a lot of our own food, even as, like, I guess going back to about World War II days, but now we grow about less than 0.5% of our own food. That can have a major impact. But impact investing is another one, so ethical investments. And I would highly recommend people check out, Claire Smith the founder of the vegan ETF, has a platform called beyondanimal.ca, and there's also a website, crueltyfreeinvesting.org. That's another way to vote with your dollars, is to tune into those platforms. Talking to your MP is another undervalued tool, especially when you call them or you don't send them one of these cookie cutter petitions, which I'm not against, but there's a lot of value in approaching your MP, for example, asking why the food guide in Canada hasn't been operationalized. Or if you live in a different area in the world, like, why isn't our food guide more like that one, which is, Canada's was based on 3.5 years of science and health research. I would also like to give a shout out to PlantBased Data, which is a website I'm familiar with. I believe you've had Tushar on more than once, Dr. Tushar Mehta and Nicholas Carter. We have resource lists on there for people that they can check out if they're more interested in these things, and we'll be updating and growing it, as well as Animal Justice, who you guys are well familiar with. They have, my friend Kimberly Carroll there is developing a policy academy, which will equip people, like the average people like you and I, with more tools on how we can have more impact. But really, like, investing with your dollars and paying attention to, like, good people doing good things, the Good Food Institute, as I mentioned to you guys, places like that, is a really good place to start.
Thank you for all of those tips. And I hope that whether people are here in Canada or outside of Canada, that they'll try to find similar things or try to create what we have going on, or just look for something that they can do to support in their area as well. You mentioned plant-based data with Dr. Tushar Mehta, and I just wanted I know that you've had a really integral part with that, so I wanted you to just let everybody know what that is, and that'll have to be a conversation that we have another day, maybe getting all three of you on, but can you tell us a little bit more about that in a nutshell?
Yeah, sure. That one's easy. It's a one-stop shop for all high-level research, plant-based research. So Dr. Mehta Tushar is responsible for the health, and he also covers zoonoses. Nick Carter, an environmental researcher, is responsible for the environment. He also is like the caretaker for the website. He's done a great job. And then I'm overseeing the econ and policy sections. And it really is Tushar's brainchild. So there's plans for it to grow even further, but it's already got some real momentum and legs. It definitely got a jump start when Rich Roll and Simon Hill took notice. And there's a ton of journal papers on there. There's over 1,000 peer-reviewed, and we do summaries of key papers and post them. And if you subscribe to the website, you'll get our periodic email updates and Medium pieces and whatnot.
Love that. That's amazing. So I encourage everybody to check that out, and we will put it on the show notes at planttrainers.com. And tell us a little bit before we go. Everybody knows that we've done lots of work with the TVA, the Toronto Veg Food Fest. Can you tell us a little bit more about that for those people who don't know? Maybe they're looking to give some kind of holiday donation. Plug.
Happily. So the Toronto Veg Association is Canada's oldest plant-based organization. Our mission statement is three-pronged. It's to inspire people to choose a healthier, greener, and more compassionate lifestyle through plant-based living. Most people in Toronto will be familiar with the Veg Food Fest, which is North America's largest plant-based festival every year. Unfortunately, this year, obviously, we couldn't have it in person. It was lovely to have you guys speak and to have an online community come together for it, though. And one area we're really expanding, because COVID has brought with it some opportunities, is expanding impact. So what can that look like locally? And for those who aren't familiar, Mayor John Tory announced last year a climate change emergency for Toronto. And as part of this summit that happened in Copenhagen, the C40 summit, which is the mayor from 40 top cities around the world getting together, I think it was probably motivated. I think it was, in fact, motivated by the Trump administration's, lack of action and people just throwing their hands up in the air. So some real good came out of that, with all these mayors getting together and by 2030 setting all these emissions. And I happen to sit on the board of directors as well for the Toronto Veg Food Bank. And somebody there was telling me that they believed, I think Toronto's the only city that chose food as the main mechanism through which to do it. So one area I'm excited about for the TVA is to have more impact. And this could be one particularly effective lever, is winding the adoption of Meatless Mondays, for example. And actually my niece, the 10-year-old I told you about at the start of the show, Karina, I do take a little bit of credit, but I had nothing to do with it. I lived with them before I was in India, going to India for my yoga training. She worked with a teacher at her school and canvassed her 300 schoolmates to start a Meatless Monday at that school, at TFS, and 80 of them agreed. And so the school, I think it's on pause because of COVID, but that strikes me as a blueprint people can use. If we can get more adoption around Meatless Mondays, if TVA can play a greater role in helping get these healthier access to healthier fruits and vegetables for Torontonians, curb meat consumption locally, we can have a real role to play that goes beyond, these holiday markets and our Veg Food Fest, and really start to get people on board with this message. It's a pretty inclusive organization, and if anybody's interested, you can check out more at veg.ca. And we have a particularly amazing board of directors this year, so I'm really excited for seeing what the future holds for us.
We talked about so many different things today, and it's such important information that we don't often share with our listeners. So thank you so much for sharing that and informing us and helping to educate all of us, including the two of us sitting here. We really do appreciate it. And we're going to link in our show notes to a lot of the things that you talked about today at planttrainers.com. If people want to reach out to you, Nital, where would be the best place for them to go?
Thank you for asking, and thank you for that. I have to, as we said in the green room here, I only recently just developed social media for plant-based economics, but I would recommend starting there. So at PlantBased Econ is the handle for Instagram and for Twitter. And you can also check out the websites, plantbasedeconomics.com, and as mentioned, plantbaseddata.org.
Amazing. So we do hope that everybody checks that out. Once again, we always leave our conversations with you inspired, having learned something, and we appreciate your time so much. And we really know that our listeners have learned and probably thought about a lot of things in a different way today. So thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all so much for listening to this edition of the Plant Trainers podcast. We want to make sure that you subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or any other podcasting platform.
We really appreciate the feedback we receive from you. Every time we get a 5-star rating or review on iTunes from one of our fans, it really helps other people find us, just like you did.
Thanks so much to our patrons. To become a patron, visit us at patreon.com/planttrainers. Even supporting us with $1 really makes a difference in the quality of the show.
And don't forget to connect with us on Instagram and Twitter. Our handle is at Plant Trainers. Like Plant Trainers on Facebook, join our newsletter, and check out our website at planttrainers.com for awesome recipes, a list of our services, and of course, our latest podcast.
We encourage you to email your questions to info@planttrainers.com so that we can help you improve your quality of life through nutrition and fitness.
So we hope we've inspired you today. Join us again next time and have a healthy day. Or is that too corny?
It's a little cheesy.